Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet bags on the dirt, the sound a dull thud in the vast waiting silence of the high country. Dust, fine as milled flour, rose in a lazy puff around the worn leather, then settled again, coating everything in the same shade of weary beige. Beside her, her son, Leo, a boy of 6, made smaller by the immensity of the sky, held her hand with a grip that was less about affection and more about anchorage. His eyes, wide in the gray of creek stones after a rain, took in the splintered corral fence, the sway-backed barn, and the ranch house that seemed to be hunkering down against the wind, not merely standing in it. Cora said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say, her voice scraped raw by dust and days on a jolting wagon. "We're here to settle a debt." The man who emerged from the barn was built of the same hard materials as the land itself. Tall and spare, with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of lifting things that did not want to be lifted, he moved with an economy that bordered on grim. His name was Elias Thorne, and his face was a map of dry seasons and hard winters. He stopped a dozen feet away, his gaze falling first on the flimsy bags, then on the boy, and finally, with a heavy and unreadable weight, on her. "The debt," he said. It was not a question. The words were flat, like stones skipped across a frozen pond. Cora reached into the pocket of her travel-worn dress and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained piece of paper. She did not offer it, but held it in her hand, a fragile testament to a bargain made by a dead man. "Robert Halloran was my husband. He signed a note for a year of labor." Elias Thorne did not move to take the paper. His eyes, the color of a faded work shirt, stayed on her face. He had seen this sort of thing before. Desperate men making desperate promises, leaving their women to clean up the mess. He had never expected anyone to actually show up to honor such a fool's bargain. He had written off the seed money the day he heard Robert Halloran had caught the fever. "Your husband is dead," he stated, as if this was a fact that should have concluded the matter. "The debt is not," Cora replied, her chin lifting a fraction. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones, her hope worn thin as an old sheet, but pride was a stubborn thread she would not let break. "A Halloran pays what they owe." Sudden commotion from the creek bed behind the barn shattered the tense quiet. A shout, then another, laced with curses. A young cow, spooked and foolish, had slipped down the muddy bank and was now mired to its belly, bawling in terror. 2 ranch hands, one a lanky youth and the other a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, were struggling with ropes, pulling at cross purposes, their efforts only serving to dig the animal in deeper. Elias Thorne turned his head, a muscle tightening in his jaw. It was a small crisis, but it was one more thing on a list of things that were slowly, inexorably going wrong. The ranch was failing, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding erosion of luck and resources. This calf, stuck and panicked, felt like a symbol of it all. Cora saw it too, but she did not see a symbol. She saw a problem that needed solving. Without a word, she set her bags down with finality, told Leo to stay put in a low, firm voice, and walked toward the creek. The mud squelched around her worn boots, but she did not hesitate. The 2 hands stopped their pulling to stare at her, this strange woman appearing out of nowhere and wading into their mess. "You're pulling her head up," Cora said, her voice clear and carrying over the animal's panicked cries. "You're fighting her. Let her feel the ground." She took the rope from the younger man, her hands moving with a practiced confidence. She retied the knot. Not a simple noose around the neck, but a bowline that distributed the pressure across the chest and shoulders. "Get that plank from the fence line," she instructed the older man, Jed, whose scowl had deepened into outright disbelief. "We're not pulling her out. We're giving her something to climb on." She spoke to the calf in a low, calming murmur, the same tone she used for Leo when he woke from a nightmare. She waited deeper, ignoring the cold mud that soaked the hem of her dress, and worked the plank down under the animal's front hooves, creating a ramp of sorts. "Now," she said, looking at the young hand. "Finn, easy pressure." Just enough to let her know which way to go. Let her do the work. Finn, wide-eyed, did as he was told. He pulled gently. The calf, feeling the solid wood beneath its hooves and the steady, non-threatening pressure of the rope, struggled forward. It found purchase. With a great sucking sound, it heaved itself up the plank and onto the solid bank, shaking and splattering them all with mud. Silence descended again, broken only by the calf's heavy breathing. Jed stared from the freed animal to Cora, his mouth slightly agape. Finn looked at her as if she had just performed a miracle. Cora simply handed the rope back to Finn and walked back to her son, her dress dripping. She stood before Elias Thorne once more, mud clinging to her skirt, her face impassive. She had not done it to impress him. She had done it because it was the thing that needed doing. Elias looked from the now safe calf to the woman standing before him. He looked at her hands, which were chapped and capable. He looked at the boy who had watched the whole affair with a silent, unnerving stillness. He looked at the piece of paper still clutched in her fist. He had intended to send her away. He had no room for charity, and less for the ghosts of other men's bad decisions. But what he had just witnessed was not a plea for charity. It was a demonstration of competence as clear and undeniable as the sun clears throat. He finally spoke, his voice different now, the flatness replaced by a grudging curiosity. The contract was for a ranch hand, not a cook. "I can cook, mend, manage a garden, keep accounts, and stretch $1 until it screams," Cora stated, ticking the items off on her fingers. "I can also set a bone, stitch a wound, and help a cow out of a muddy creek. I ran a 160-acre ranch with my husband for 5 years. I know the work." She paused. "The paper says a year of labor. It does not specify the type." Elias Thorne considered her. The thorn crest was bleeding out. His cook had quit 2 months prior, and the men had been surviving on a grim diet of bacon, beans, and Jed's rock-hard biscuits. The books were a mess. The whole operation was running on stubborn momentum and nothing more. He was tired. So deeply tired of carrying it all alone. 30 days, he said, the words coming out like a verdict. "You stay for 30 days? You earn your keep and the boys. We'll see if your husband's word is worth the paper it's written on." He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a welcome. He turned and walked back toward the house. "The cook's quarters are in the back. Finn will show you." It was not the offer she wanted, but it was the one she had. Cora watched him go, straight, unbending back that seemed to carry the weight of the entire sky. She picked up her bags, the leather suddenly feeling a little lighter. She looked at Leo, whose small hand found hers again. It was a foothold. On the hard, unforgiving ground of the thorn crest, a foothold was enough. The cook's quarters were little more than a lean-to attached to the main house, consisting of a small, musty bedroom and access to the cavernous, neglected kitchen. A thin mattress stuffed with lumpy corn husks lay on a simple wooden frame. A single window, clouded with grime, looked out onto a patch of barren dirt where a garden might once have been. It was bleak, but it had a roof, and for the first time in weeks, it was theirs. While Finn, the young hand with kind eyes, showed her the well pump and the wood pile, Cora took stock of the kitchen. It was a disaster. A greasy film covered every surface. A stack of dirty plates sat in a basin of cold, scummy water. The pantry was a study in disarray. Half-empty sacks of flour sat open to weevils. A canister of coffee beans was mixed with dried beans, and the prevailing smell was one of rancid bacon fat and despair. Any other woman might have wept. Cora Halloran saw only work to be done. She sent Leo to sit on the back step with a small wooden horse she had carved for him, a silent sentinel watching over her labors. Then she tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began. She did not start with the food. She started with the foundation. She hauled buckets of water from the well, heated them on the massive cast-iron stove, and with a bar of harsh lye soap and a stiff brush she began to scrub. She scoured the wooden countertops until the clean scent of pine filled the air. She washed the window until the late afternoon sun streamed through, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees, her movements methodical and tireless. The men came in for their evening meal, expecting the usual grim fare, and stopped dead in the doorway. The kitchen was transformed. It was clean. Not just tidy, but fundamentally, elementally clean. The air smelled of soap and wood smoke instead of grease. And on the stove a pot of stew bubbled, thick with potatoes, carrots, and the last of a tough old hen she had found in the coop, seasoned with wild thyme she had spotted growing by the well. A pan of cornbread was browning in the oven, its warm, wholesome scent a stark contrast to the memory of Jed's burnt offerings. They ate in a stunned silence. Jed, the scowling resistor, eyed her with suspicion, as if this cleanliness and good food were some kind of trick. Gus, the oldest hand, a man who rarely spoke and whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, ate his stew slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Finn ate 2 helpings with unabashed enthusiasm. Elias Thorne sat at the head of the long wooden table, eating with a deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. But when he was finished, he placed his fork and knife neatly together on his clean plate, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of order that mirrored her own. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by Cora's quiet competence. She rose before the sun, her first act to start the fire in the big stove, its warmth pushing back the chill of the high country morning. The smell of fresh coffee and frying salt pork became the new signal for the men to start their day. She did not just cook, she managed. She inventoried the pantry, making a precise list of what was needed, noting the exorbitant prices on the invoices from Blackwood's Mercantile in the nearby town. She started a sourdough culture in a crock on the mantelpiece, its tangy scent a promise of future bread. Her work was a language without words. Every mended shirt returned to a nail by the door. Every polished tool, every well-planned meal was a sentence in a long, unfolding argument for her own worth. She was not performing for an audience. This was simply how she was built. Order was her response to chaos, methodical work her shield against despair. She moved without wasted motion, her focus absolute. Whether she was kneading dough, hoeing the hard-packed earth of the garden patch she was determined to revive, or rendering lard from a freshly slaughtered hog, there was a deep and abiding grace in her efficiency. Elias Thorne watched it all, He was a man accustomed to the loud, clumsy efforts of men. Cora's quiet effectiveness was something entirely new. He would see her from his office window, her small figure bent over the garden, coaxing life from soil that had given up. He would walk through the kitchen in the evening and find it spotless, the next day's preparations already laid out. He noticed the morale of his men lifting. They complained less. They worked harder. A good meal and a clean shirt, it turned out, were more motivating than any amount of yelling. He found himself thinking about the paper in his desk drawer. The flimsy document felt increasingly absurd, an inadequate measure of the woman who was steadily, quietly, putting his broken house back in order. He had agreed to a transaction, a year of labor for a forgiven debt. But what was happening felt less like a transaction and more like a restoration. He was a man who believed in ledgers and clear accounts, but he had no way to quantify the value of the hope that was beginning to seep back into the cracks of the thorn crest. Leo, in his silent way, was also finding his place. He spent his days within sight of his mother, a small, still point in the bustling world of the ranch. He would sit on the porch steps, whittling a piece of scrap wood with a small, dull knife Cora had given him. He did not speak, had not spoken a full sentence since his father's death, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched the men, the horses, the chickens scratching in the dust. Finn was the first of the hands to bridge the gap. He started leaving small offerings for the boy on the porch rail, a smooth river stone, an interesting feather, a piece of licorice he'd bought in town. He would talk to Leo, not expecting an answer, telling him about the horses or the work he was doing. One afternoon Leo looked up from his whittling as Finn passed and held out the small wooden horse. It was a gesture of profound trust, and Finn accepted it with a solemnity that honored the gift. Gus, the old sage, saw the exchange from the shade of the barn, and the corner of his mouth twitched, the territory right next to a smile. Jed, however, remained a bastion of resistance. He saw Cora's competence not as a blessing, but as a disruption. He was a man comfortable in the familiar mire of dysfunction. He complained that the bread was too soft, the stew had too many vegetables, the coffee was brewed too strong. His grumbling was a constant low-level static in the background of the improving ranch. He represented the inertia, the stubborn belief that because things had always been a certain way, they should remain that way. The confrontation, when it came, was not over anything important. It was over biscuits. Cora's biscuits were a revelation, light, fluffy, layered with lard, a world away from the dense, tooth-breaking pucks Jed had occasionally produced. They had become the highlight of the morning meal. One morning, Jed pushed his plate away with a clatter. "Can a man get a decent, hard biscuit around here?" he grumbled, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "This is a working ranch, not a tea party in town." The other men fell silent, looking from Jed to Cora. Cora was at the stove, her back to them, a heavy cast-iron skillet in her hand. She did not turn around immediately. The tension in the room thickened. Leo, sitting on his small stool by the hearth, looked at Jed with his wide, unblinking eyes. Finally, Cora turned, placing the skillet on the stovetop with a deliberate, soft clang. She looked directly at Jed, her expression calm, her eyes clear. "A full belly makes for a better day's work, Jed," she said, her voice even. "Or has your experience been different?" Jed's face flushed a dull red. He was spoiling for a fight, for a moment where he could reassert the old messy order. "I'm just saying, things are changing, getting soft. Before Cora could respond, Elias spoke from the head of the table. He had been watching the entire exchange, his face like granite. "Her biscuits are the best we've had on this ranch in 10 years, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "If you don't like them, Jed, you're welcome to do the cooking yourself." Starting tomorrow, the challenge hung in the air. Jed was a passable ranch hand but a famously terrible cook. The thought of returning to his own culinary creations was enough to make the other men visibly flinch. Jed looked down at his plate, defeated. He picked up one of the soft biscuits, tore it in half, and shoved it in his mouth without another word. Crisis was over. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Elias had not just defended Cora. He had publicly validated her contribution and affirmed her authority in her domain. He had chosen the new way over the old. From that day on, Jed's complaints ceased. He did not become friendly, but he became compliant. His resistance broken not by force, but by a combination of fluffy biscuits and irrefutable logic. With the internal resistance quelled, Cora's influence began to expand beyond the kitchen. She had a mind for systems, for seeing how one part of the ranch affected another. Elias, accustomed to making every decision alone, found himself discussing things with her. It started small. He would mention a sick horse, and she would suggest an old remedy of boiled linseed and molasses that actually worked. He would complain about the cost of feed, and she would point out that repairing the chicken coop and doubling their flock would provide a steady supply of eggs and meat, reducing their reliance on Blackwood's store. Her greatest contribution, however, came from the place he had neglected the most, his own office. The room was a chaotic jumble of dusty papers, leather-bound ledgers, and faded maps. It was the heart of the ranch's business, and its heart was failing. Elias hated paperwork. He was a man of the land, of cattle and horses. The numbers and legal documents felt like a foreign language he had never bothered to learn properly. One evening, seeking an invoice, Cora stepped into the office. She found Elias at his desk, his head in his hands, a stack of bills and threatening letters from the bank spread before him. The weariness she had seen in him on her first day was back etched so deeply into his face that it seemed to be part of the bone structure. For the first time she saw past the gruff-guarded owner and saw a man drowning in a silent, solitary battle. "Let me help," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes defensive, ready to refuse, but the offer was not made out of pity. It was made with the same calm capability she brought to everything else. He was tired of being alone in his worry. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resistance, he nodded. For the next 2 weeks, Cora spent her evenings in that office, Leo asleep in the next room. With the same methodical patience she used to scrub the kitchen, she began to bring order to the chaos. She sorted the bills, organized the receipts, and began to work her way through the old ledgers. She was not an accountant, but she had a farmer's practical sense of numbers. She knew the rhythm of profit and loss, the delicate balance between a good year and a disastrous one. It was deep in a ledger from 5 years prior that she found the first anomaly. A recurring payment to Silas Blackwood, the owner of the neighboring ranch and the town's only mercantile. The entry was labeled Creek Water Access Fee. It was a significant sum, paid quarterly. She followed the entry back through the years, a steady drain on the Thorn Crest's resources. This struck her as odd. She knew the layout of the land now. Thorn Creek originated high up on Elias's own property, from a spring that Gus had once proudly called the Thorn Heart. Why would Elias be paying a fee to access his own water? She began to search through the chest of old documents, pulling out brittle property deeds and hand-drawn survey maps that dated back to Elias's grandfather's time. The ink was faded, the language dense with legal jargon, but she persisted, tracing the property lines, cross-referencing them with the creek's path. After 3 nights of painstaking work, she found it, a clause in the original founding deed, clearly stating that all water rights originating on Thorn land from the spring to the point where the creek crossed into the valley belonged exclusively to the owner of the Thorn Crest property. Silas Blackwood, whose land lay downstream, had been charging Elias Thorn for years for water that was by law and by nature already his. It was not just overcharging. It was systematic fraud. She waited until the next evening. After the men had eaten and the kitchen was clean, she laid the old deed and the ledger side by side on the kitchen table. She did not present her findings as an accusation against his oversight, but simply as a set of facts. Elias, she began, her voice steady, I think you should look at this. He came and stood over the table, his shadow falling across the papers. He read the entry in the ledger, then the clause in the deed. He read it again. A dark flush crept up from his collar. The weariness in his face was replaced by a slow-burning anger, directed as much at himself as at Blackwood. He had trusted his neighbor. He had taken the man at his word, too preoccupied with the daily struggle of running the ranch to question the arrangement his father had made years ago. My father, Elias said, his voice a low growl. He always said Silas's father was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. I thought Silas was different, a better man. He looked at Cora, and the anger in his eyes softened into something else, something she had never seen there before. A profound and unreserved respect. But you've done more for this ranch in 2 months of evenings than I've managed in 10 years of daylight. He reached out and for the first time touched her. It was not a romantic gesture, but one of deep gratitude and partnership. He placed his hand briefly on her shoulder. Thank you, Cora. That night, something fundamental shifted between them. The pretense of employer and indebted servant dissolved, replaced by the unspoken acknowledgement of a partnership. He was no longer just the gatekeeper, and she was no longer just the outsider. They were 2 capable people fighting for the same piece of land. The paper in his desk drawer, the one that defined her as a debt to be paid, had never felt more irrelevant. The discovery of Blackwood's deception galvanized Elias. The very next week he rode into town, the old deed safely tucked in his saddlebag, to consult with a lawyer. The legal path was clear, but it would be slow. In the meantime, he confronted Silas Blackwood directly at the mercantile. The confrontation was brief and cold. Elias informed Blackwood that the water access payments would cease immediately and that he would be seeking repayment for past fees. Blackwood, a large man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes, feigned ignorance and then outrage. But Elias stood his ground. The encounter ended with Blackwood issuing a veiled threat. You'll find water is a tricky thing, Thorn. Sometimes it flows, and sometimes it doesn't. The words hung in the air long after Elias had ridden away. They were a harbinger. As the summer deepened, a drought settled over the high country. The sky turned a metallic, unforgiving blue, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury. The grasses in the pastures turned from green to gold to a brittle, dusty brown. The level of the creek dropped daily, shrinking to a thin, sluggish ribbon of water between wide banks of cracked mud. Water became the most precious currency on the Thorn Crest. The men worked tirelessly, moving the cattle to the higher pastures where some green remained, carefully managing their access to the dwindling creek. Every bucket of water for the house and garden was used and reused. The tension on the ranch was palpable, a low hum of anxiety that vibrated just beneath the surface of the daily routines. It was during this precarious time that a letter arrived from the lawyer in the capital. The case regarding the water rights required Elias's presence to file an official deposition. He would have to be gone for at least a week, maybe more. He was reluctant to leave his instincts screaming that this was the worst possible time to be away. The ranch felt vulnerable, exposed. "I'll manage," Cora told him, her calm a steadying force against his anxiety. "Gus knows the land better than anyone. Finn is a hard worker. Jed will do what he's told. We'll be fine." Elias looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face. He had come to rely on it on her more than he had realized. He was leaving his ranch, his entire world, in her hands. A few months ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. Now it felt like the only logical choice. He gave her instructions, handed her the keys to his office and a lockbox, and rode out at dawn, a grim set to his jaw. For 3 days after his departure, things held steady. The routine Cora had established was a strong framework, and the men, now accustomed to her quiet authority, followed her direction. But on the morning of the 4th day, Finn came running from the upper pasture, his face pale with alarm. "The spring!" he gasped, breathing heavily. "It's gone dry." Cora, Gus, and Jed saddled horses and rode up to the source of the creek, the place Gus called the Thorn Heart. It was a shallow, rock-lined pool that was usually fed by a steady, bubbling flow from deep within the earth. Now it was nothing but a patch of damp, black mud. The heart had stopped beating. Gus knelt, examining the ground. His weathered face was grim. "This ain't the drought," he said, his voice raspy. He pointed to a set of fresh tracks, deliberately scuffed, but still visible in the soft earth. "Shod horse. 2 of 'em. And see here." He indicated a place where the earth had been disturbed, where rocks and heavy clay had been packed into the fissure from which the water flowed. This was deliberate. Someone's dammed it. Blocked it at the source. The source lay just on the other side of the ridge line on property that belonged to Silas Blackwood. Blackwood's threat echoed in Cora's mind. Sometimes it flows, and sometimes it doesn't. The full weight of their situation crashed down on her. Without the spring, the creek would be bone dry in a day. The cattle, already weakened by the drought, would not survive for long. Blackwood had not waited for the courts. He had taken matters into his own hands, launching a direct, devastating attack on the ranch's lifeline. Panic began to ripple through the men. Jed kicked at a rock, cursing Blackwood's name. "We're finished! He's got us!" "We'll have to sell the herd for pennies on the dollar." Cora stood very still, the hot wind whipping strands of hair across her face. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but her mind was strangely clear. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. She had faced ruin before, had lost everything she held dear. That loss had burned away everything but the essential core of her. She would not break. "No," he said, her voice cutting through Jed's panicked rant. It was quiet, but held a steel that made them all turn to look at her. "We're not finished." She turned to Gus, Elias's grandfather. You told me he was worried about the Apache raiding parties cutting off the creek. You said he built a fallback, a cistern. Gus's eyes clouded with worry, sharpened with a flicker of memory. The old cistern. Aye, he did. Up in the North Canyon. Haven't seen it in 30 years. It's likely caved in. Bone dry if it ain't. But it might not be, Cora insisted, her mind racing, seizing on this one sliver of hope. It was fed by winter runoff, wasn't it? From the snow melt on the peaks. It's a closed system. The drought wouldn't have touched it. It's a long shot, Cora, Jed grumbled, though the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by a grudging curiosity. It's the only shot we have, she countered. She looked at the three men, her gaze steady and direct. We have maybe 2 days of water left in the lower pools for the herd. We have to find that cistern, clear the channel to the troughs, and get the cattle moved before they start to drop. Finn, you're the fastest rider. Go to the lower pasture and start slowly moving the herd north. Don't panic them. Jed, we'll need shovels, axes, and all the rope we have. Gus, you'll have to guide us. You're the only one who might remember the way. She was not asking for their permission. She was not suggesting a plan. She was giving orders. And in that moment of absolute crisis, under the crushing weight of the silent hot sky, no one questioned her. The authority in her voice was not born of ego or title. It was the pure, unadorned authority of competence. They saw the solution in her eyes before she had even finished speaking it. They rode hard for the North Canyon, a desolate rocky place shunned by the cattle and rarely visited by the men. Gus led them, navigating by memory, following topographical lines that only he could read. After an hour of searching, he stopped. It should be here, he muttered, shaking his head. Right at the base of this rock fall, it looked hopeless. A massive slide of rock and earth, overgrown with mesquite and tough thorny bushes, covered the canyon wall. But Cora, dismounting, noticed something Gus's older eyes had missed. A line of darker, healthier-looking scrub growing in a perfectly straight line away from the rockfall. An old buried water channel. Here, she said, pointing. It's here. We dig. For the rest of the day. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy. The sun was a hammer, and the air was thick with dust and the metallic clang of shovels against rock. Cora worked alongside them, her smaller frame belying a deep, wiry strength. She cleared brush, hauled rocks, her hands becoming raw and blistered. She did not complain or slow down. Her presence, her sheer, unyielding determination, was the engine that drove them all. Even Jed, his shirt soaked with sweat, worked with a grim focus. His earlier despair burned away by the cleansing fire of hard labor. He found himself watching her, this small woman who refused to be beaten, and a feeling he could not name but which felt a lot like awe began to take root in his stubborn heart. Late in the afternoon, Jed's shovel hit something that was not rock. It was wood. They dug faster, clearing the dirt and debris to uncover a set of heavy, stone-lined wooden doors set into the hillside. It was the entrance to the cistern. With their combined strength, they pried the doors open. A wave of cool, damp air washed over them, smelling of stone and clean, deep water. They peered into the darkness. Gus lit a lantern, and its flickering light revealed a vast, stone-walled cavern, stretching back into the hill, and at the bottom, shimmering in the lantern light, was water. Deep, clear, and still. The cistern was nearly half full. A ragged cheer went up from the men. They had done it. They had found their salvation. Their work was not over. They spent the next day clearing the stone-lined channel that led from the cistern to a series of old stone troughs further down the canyon. By evening, Finn arrived with the exhausted, thirsty herd. As Cora opened the sluice gate and the first gush of precious water filled the troughs, the lowing of the grateful cattle was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. They had won. They had faced Blackwood's sabotage and beaten it, not with violence or anger, but with memory, intelligence, and sheer hard work. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, they saw a rider approaching. It was Silas Blackwood. He had ridden over to witness their defeat, to see the dying cattle and the desperate faces, to make his final predatory offer. Instead, he saw the entire Thorn herd, alive and drinking deeply from the troughs. He saw the 3 ranch hands, dirty and exhausted, but standing tall. And he saw Cora Halloran standing by the sluice gate, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw, her expression one of weary triumph. His face, when he recognized what they had done, was a mask of disbelief and thwarted rage. "Where did you get that water?" he demanded, his voice tight with fury. It was Gus who answered, his voice carrying the weight of his years and his loyalty to the land. "This here is Thorn land, Silas," he said, stepping forward, "and this is Thorn water, always has been. Best you move on." Jed and Finn moved to stand beside him, a silent, unified front. Blackwood looked at their determined faces, then at Cora. He saw no fear in her. He saw no opening, no weakness to exploit. He had played his hand and he had lost. His power was broken, not by Elias Thorn, but by the quiet, capable woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a widow working off a debt. Without another word, Silas Blackwood wheeled his horse around and rode away, his defeat as total as it was public. Elias returned 2 days later, his legal business in the capital concluded successfully. He rode in expecting to find a ranch on the brink of collapse. Instead, he found his cattle safe in the North Canyon, his men working with a renewed sense of purpose, and the story of Cora's leadership already becoming a local legend. Gus told him the whole story, his sparse words painting a more vivid picture than any flowery speech could have. He told him how Cora had remembered the cistern, how she had led the work, how she had faced down Blackwood. "She saved us, Elias," Gus concluded, his voice filled with a simple, profound respect. "She saved this ranch." That evening, Elias found Cora by the kitchen garden, where she was carefully watering the wilted but still living plants with a bucket from the house. The setting sun bathed the valley in a soft golden light, smoothing the harsh edges of the land. They stood in silence for a long time, the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed many words. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I went to the capital to save my ranch. I came back to find you'd already done it." Cora looked up from her work, her face tired but serene. "We did it," she corrected him gently. "Everyone did their part. They followed you," he insisted. "Jed follows you. I never thought I'd see the day." He looked out at the sprawling land, his land, which had come so close to being lost. "When I left, I gave you my keys. I put you in charge of my house, my accounts. I trusted you with everything I own. But you took charge of its soul." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded, worn piece of paper she had given him on her first day. The debt contract. He held it in his hands, looking at his own signature and the faded, desperate scrawl of Robert Halloran. Robert was a good man, but a poor planner, Elias said, his voice soft. He made a bad deal out of desperation. But he sent me the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. He looked from the paper to her face, his eyes holding a depth of feeling she had never seen in him. This debt is paid, Cora. It was paid the day you pulled that calf from the mud. It was paid every time you put a decent meal on that table. It was more than paid when you saved my herd. Slowly, deliberately, he tore the paper in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall from his fingers. They fluttered to the dry ground like dead leaves, a meaningless scatter of scraps. The symbol of her servitude, the reason for her presence, was gone. She was free, but she did not feel like leaving. In the hard soil of the Thorn Crest, she had, against all odds, put down roots. The paper is gone, Elias continued, taking a step closer. So I have to make you a new offer, not based on a debt, but on what's right. This ranch, it's too much for one person. I see that now. It needs more than just an owner. He hesitated, the words new and clumsy in his mouth. It needs a partner, this place. It's not just mine anymore, Cora. If you'll have it, it's ours. It was more than a business proposition. It was an offer of a life of a shared future. It was an offer of a home. Cora looked at the house, where a lamp had just been lit, casting a warm yellow glow from the window. She could see Leo through the glass, sitting at the kitchen table, carefully drawing on a piece of scrap paper Finn had given him. He looked peaceful, safe. He looked like he belonged. She turned back to Elias, and a real, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time since Robert's death. It was a small, quiet thing, but it lit up her whole face. Yes, Elias, she said, I think it is. Music. The final scene was not one of high drama or grand pronouncements. It was one of quiet, settled peace. Months had passed. The autumn rains had come, breaking the drought and turning the pastures green again. Inside the warm kitchen of the Thorncrest ranch house, Cora was kneading dough for the morning's bread, her movements rhythmic and sure. The scent of yeast and wood smoke filled the room. At the long table, Elias sat cleaning a rifle. The metallic click of its action, a familiar, comforting sound. And in the corner, Leo sat on the floor, leaning against Gus's leg, listening as the old man in his low, raspy voice quietly told him a story about a clever coyote. For the first time, a small, soft sound came from the boy. Giggle. It was a sound of pure, unburdened childhood. Elias and Cora exchanged a look over the table, a look of shared understanding, of deep and abiding contentment. The Thorn Crest had been a piece of property, a struggling business, a legacy of hardship. It had been run by a man who was tired of fighting alone. It had been a place that needed a ranch hand, a cook. But what it got in the end was something more. What it got was the woman who made it a home.